Hi there, this is Pay Attention Interviews about Truth in Troubling Times. And today I am here with Professor David Jobes. And I'm very happy to be here with him. And we are going to be talking specifically about suicide prevention. David Jobes, Ph.D., is a professor of psychology and associate director of clinical training at the Catholic University of America and the director of the Catholic University of America's Suicide Prevention Lab. Dr. Jobes' research and writing in suicide have produced well over 100 peer-reviewed publications, and he also has 6 books. 2 of his books relevant to today's conversation are Managing Suicidal Risks and Adolescent Suicide. As an internationally recognized suicidologist, Dr. Jobes is past president of the American Association of Suicidology and was a recipient of that organization's 1995 Schneidman Award in recognition of early career contribution to suicide research. Dr. Jobes also received the 2012 Dublin Award in recognition of career contributions and the 2015 Linehan Award in recognition of his groundbreaking clinical research. Many of you may recognize Marsha Linehan's name, and she's written the foreword to his book and also incredible recommendations and endorsements for his work. Dr. Jobes is widely recognized for originating, researching, and training the collaborative assessment and management of suicidality, and that we will be referring to as CAMS, that's the acronym for it, which is a suicide-focused clinical assessment and treatment method that has garnered a strong evidence base and has been successful in dramatically decreasing suicidal ideation and symptom distress while giving people who are suicidal the hope, the skills, and the insight for dealing with their profound suffering and their existential dilemmas. So welcome, David. I'm very pleased to have you here during these troubling times in which suicide has increased in all age groups, but especially among teenagers and young adults that we'll be talking about in depth today. And I understand that suicide is now the second leading cause of death among people 10 years to 34 years old in the US, the first cause being unintentional injury or accident. So I'm looking forward to the guidance that you can give listeners about what they can do, especially with their adolescent and young adult children in relation to anxieties and fears about suicide, and also what we might think about in a larger context about increasing the hope for living among that population especially. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Polly. I'm delighted to be with you.
So before we talk specifically about your advice, your clinical work, and CAMS, I would like to talk a little bit about suicide itself, because I think often people assume things about suicide, whether they're clinicians or ordinary people. We often don't think about suicide itself. And many people assume, I find in the general public and among clinicians, that suicide is almost always associated with depression, that somehow it's associated with a mental health problem, let's say. But as you have made clear from your research and your clinical experience, suicide is about unbearable suffering and pain, and it has implications on a larger way for one's existence, and it's not merely a symptom of a disorder. In other words, many situations and conditions motivate people to consider suicide as a kind of solution to the problems they're facing. And so I wonder if you would talk with us first about your understanding of suicide, and also along those lines, if we can talk about how sometimes people who are considering suicide are wary of mental health professionals and wary of coming for help. So
obviously, I'm immersed in this topic now for about 35 years, and I've thought a lot about this. I've never personally been suicidal, but I've probably sat with hundreds, thousands of people over the years in different settings. And in my lab, we watch videos of clinicians trying to do our intervention and other interventions in the work that we do in our treatment research. And what I would say is, we know that on average, about 130 Americans will die by the end of this evening, and about maybe 40 to 50, give or take, would be clinically depressed. So that means that there are a lot of other things going on in play. And this sort of simplistic notion that suicide and depression are kind of synonymous is one that I'd like to decouple, because millions of Americans are depressed. And, in the most recent data, 2019 data, 47,000 plus took their lives. So that's a tiny fraction of the people that are depressed. So I think it's more complex, and people like to think of this maybe or the media thinks of it, or the public opinion is sort of to think of it sort of simplistically, depression kills. And that's not really true by a lot.
Right.
But a subset of depressed people, certainly think about people who have schizophrenia and anxiety disorders and crises in their lives and their work and love. They're certainly the people that we study most in the research that we do. So I think I think about, my Congressman Raskin, who just litigated he's the lead manager of the impeachment, and he's my congressman here in Maryland. And tragically, his son, Thomas, took his life on New Year's Day.
Oh,
And
my gosh.
as is so often the case with newly bereaved, especially prominent families like his family here in Maryland, there's a discussion about depression. His depression got him. And on the one hand, I'm so moved by the candor that my congressman has brought to this topic and openness to acknowledging that his son took his life. And yet, to me, it's a part of a narrative that needs a little bit of rethinking, because it's not just depression.
Right. Right.
Depression may be necessary, but not sufficient. And it's a certain kind of depression where people think, I have to do this to meet my needs to get out of the situation that I'm in.
Well, many times I have over the years thought of suicide as connected to shame more than depression. And I know we're going to talk about shame later, but I find that the sense of life, let's say, no longer being possible or no longer being meaningful, usually is a fairly complex set of issues for people, at least, who are coming to psychotherapy. I mean, there may be lots of people that I don't encounter in a close way who commit suicide, and I know for some people it is impulsive, and even for some of the younger people I have seen in some cases I've supervised in a private military university, Norwich University, which is close to me here in Vermont. The suicidal attempts were impulsive. They weren't connected to a plan, but they were connected to a person who was feeling really bad about life and suddenly, does something that's impulsive. So I think it's important to have a more complex conversation about what suicide is, that it's not always associated with a plan. It's not always also associated with depression. It may be, and in many ways, we have more, let's say, forces assembled against that kind of thinking than we have against perhaps the idea that someone who is young might impulsively do something because they feel hopeless on a particular day after breaking up with a romantic partner, or after, failing at something or making a big mistake. So that's why I want to open up that conversation.
Ed Schneidman, who's the founder of American Suicidality, is professor at University of California in Los Angeles, used to say very clever things, but among those things, he would say, it's a bad idea to kill yourself when you're feeling suicidal. And I think there's a kind of wisdom in that, where you're probably not thinking well, you're probably distorted in your thinking. Your cognitions and perceptions are probably distorted. You're not problem solving well. you may be more sort of limbically on fire as your amygdala is dysregulating you. And we know from a neuroscience standpoint, that means your frontal lobes are probably offline.
Right. Right.
And so we think a lot in this field about, as you know, risk factors. And there's been a sort of a movement of late. It's become kind of de rigueur to sort of say risk factors are worthless and risk assessment's a waste of time because we can't predict future suicides. And there's a psychiatrist in 1983, George Murphy, who said, we can't predict suicides, but we can talk about relative risk.
Mhm.
So this new fad of kind of bashing risk assessment, I think, is unfortunate because we know we can't predict, but it doesn't mean that we can't see certain things if we're thoughtful about entering the phenomenology, if you will, of a suicidal person, whether that's a 14-year-old or a 70-year-old. That to me is sort of the key is, Ed used to say, and I totally agree with this, that in the mind's eye of a suicidal person, suicide makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
And
Yes.
another favorite, sort of colleague, Israel Orbach in Israel, used to say, to actually do therapeutic work with a suicidal person, you have to be empathic of the suicidal wish, and
Yeah.
that's the beginning of a therapeutic relationship with someone who's contemplating the end of their life. So I agree with all that, and think that what you're sort of alluding to is that clinicians, or I think we both probably agree that clinicians have a reluctance to sort of climb into that world.
Yes.
And
Yes. Yes.
there's lots of reasons for that, not the least of which is fear of litigation and fear of not being able to get back out, or the
Mhm.
fear of
Mhm.
responsibility should this person take their life, when that's exactly what the suicidal person requires.
It does require that. And I think, even to think about, just again in the larger framework of how we're going to be speaking today, the fact that many of the first responders, so to speak, to the suicidal person are often, and particularly the younger person, would often not be the therapist, but the parents or the teacher or sometimes the pastor. And what I find these days, I'm talking to a lot of parents whose children are at home from, they've been staying at home when they otherwise would have been at college or when they otherwise would have been at high school. And for these teenager, young adult, stay at home children, there can be quite a lot of talking about suicide
Mm,
or even a casual statement, well, I'm going to kill myself if this
mm,
doesn't change.
mm.
And so knowing how to respond to that and knowing how to even think about that as a parent or a teacher, much less as a therapist. I mean, with a therapist, you get into the liability issues that
Yeah.
I think can be disruptive. But is there a way that you think that just even a parent or a teacher hearing a young person or somebody who's, locked down at home saying, gosh, I just feel like I'm going to kill myself or I'm going to have to kill myself, when you're not really sure that they mean that seriously because they're saying it casually or they're saying it, you know, at breakfast or something.
Offhandedly.
Yeah, offhandedly, right.
Yeah, I think, no lives get saved by sweeping this under the rug.
Yeah.
And so the clinical suicidologists, typically would say that especially a teacher, especially a parent, especially a peer, is uniquely positioned much more in some ways than mental health professionals are to go into that space and engage on that topic. And it's scary. And you can like own your fear and anxiety, about having that conversation, but you'll regret it if you don't. I
So
can't
do
tell
you
you, I can't tell you how many parents who've lost kids to suicide have so many regrets
yeah.
about conversations they wish they had in hindsight. And
Do you
so
have a do you have advice that you would give to the parent, the teacher, the pastor, or the peer if this comes up even in a casual way? Is there something that you would say, well, try this or think about it like this? Or
no, I wouldn't be that directive. I would be, I know it's a hard time for everyone. Pandemic has been hard on all of us. Seems to me that you're going through a particularly hard time. Have you had thoughts of giving up and ending your life? And I would ask it just that sort of simply and without judgment or a wagging finger or anything that would be
Mhm.
invalidating or admonishing of them, because for them it may be a sensible thing to contemplate. And that's the trick, is that if you have the courage to ask the question, you got to have the courage to hear the answer, and to not squash it or jump on it or immediately run to the phone to call the police. It is something that the irony or the paradox is, the more you can be with them and talking about that, the less the intensity of the feeling, I think, holds sway. And so you can take a deep breath, or take a deep cleansing breath, a big diaphragmatic breath, and sort of say, well, that's not something I wanted to hear, but I need to hear because I care about you and I want to really explore this with you. I wrote a chapter years ago with a very famous psychoanalyst named John Malzberger, who was at Harvard and attending at McLean Hospital. And we talked about, on the therapy side of it, being the therapist voyeur versus a therapist participant.
Mm-hmm.
And out of empathic dread, we would sort of be on the outside looking in and saying, oh gosh, Paul, it looks like you're like really struggling in there, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and be very professional, but be detached.
Mm-hmm.
Where from the alternative model that we advocate, the therapist participant, you with empathic resonance, you would go into that space and not close the door behind you, but you go into that space and explore that phenomenology, that struggle, and that exploration in itself is therapeutic and supportive and helpful, and I think probably de-shames or validates that person's experience, is central. And you don't have to have a MD or a PhD or a master's degree to be a good human being who cares about somebody, that has the courage to go into that space. And then you have to come back out. So, I mean, in the professional model, I ended up inventing a whole treatment system
Mm-hmm.
that sort of perforce gets somebody to do a version of that. But on the parental side that we're talking about, I mean, we've had our millennial sons here at the house, and it's been hard. You know, my older son was here for about 4 months when the pandemic first hit, and ended up taking taking a nationalized exam, and has since moved out. But it was not what he was expecting to be doing when he's 25 years old. But we had an amazing time with them.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of made the best of it, and I'm not saying it was perfect, but he took it upon himself to do self-improvement and things like that, where a lot of his peers were going to bars and getting out and sort of betraying the rules. And then my younger son graduated virtually in May and moved in with us, not what he expected to do after college. And now he's applying to graduate school, and he's here with us. And again, it's not what he would hope to do, but we talk a lot. And and I keep saying, someday you'll look back on this as kind of a gift, but not now.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've had this really extraordinary time together, and it's been a worldwide pandemic, and we're going to come out of this, and you're going to be on your way, and we'll love you no matter what. But there are these challenges. But I think I don't ever want to be simplistic, but I think there are, it's a cliche, but I think it's true. In every crisis, there's danger and opportunity.
Yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree about that. Although I have also in therapy, been dealing with parents whose children haven't thrived like yours may have in this lockdown. And as you were describing the sort of opening of a conversation, and I completely agree with you that it's important for the parent to enter in, or the teacher, or the pastor, or the peer, and yet entering into that conversation in which you're asking a young person or a young adult, have you thought of taking your life? It is very difficult, especially if you care deeply about that other person. If you are a parent, I mean, there are the difficulties of being a clinician in the sense that you have a set of liabilities and circumstances, but being a parent, I think what the parent actually wants most of all is the problem to evaporate.
Yeah,
They just want the problem to go away because it's an awful problem.
it is.
And but I think they're going to have to step into a conversation, as you were implying, in which that individual may be looking at suicide as a solution.
Yeah.
You
Well, let's put it
know?
this way. I routinely meet with families who have concerns about a loved one, a child,
Yeah,
typically, parents, and who doesn't want treatment, who
yeah.
does not want to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker, a counselor, just refuses. And they're desperate because they feel, and probably rightly so, that they're, or maybe they know that they're thinking about suicide. Maybe there's been an attempt, maybe there's been a hospitalization. And this is very much in the struggle of the family. And what I will do is say, invariably, it's a metaphor, but it's true, is that you want to leave it all in the field.
Hmm.
You do not want to look back, 10 years from now and say, I wish I'd done this, or I wish I'd done that. You want to say, God forbid, you were to lose your child, that you left it all in the field. So what I literally have them do, Polly, is write a letter to this person about their
Hmm.
concerns and what they hope for them and what they wish for them and what they were willing to do for them.
Hmm.
I have them give this person a physical care package. It may be their millennial, daughter living in the basement. It may be
Mm-hmm.
their teenager,
Mm-hmm.
but literally give them a package. And one of the things I would put in that package is a book written by two colleagues, one in particular, Tom Ellis and Corey Newman, called Choosing to Live. It's a book written for suicidal people.
Hmm. Very good.
And what I like about that is that it's a very respectful book written by two very thoughtful cognitive therapists about, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thoroughly considered what it means to take your life? But not in a finger wagging kind of way.
Right,
It's
right.
very respectful and very thoughtful. And I would include the National Text Line, information about the National Text Line. I would include information about the National Lifeline. I would include resources for the American Association of Suicidology and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. I would just put it all in that box and I would give it to that person.
Mm-hmm. That's really a good idea. I
Well,
like that very much.
it's very concrete. And I am willing to talk to you at a moment's notice, 24/7, 365. And that I'm here for you, but I cannot, you're too old for me, in our case, you're too old for me to tell you what to do as your parent.
Right.
But I would do anything for you.
Yeah. Right.
And if it's a minor or a teenager, it's even more dicey
Yeah.
because the autonomy and dependency is still being sorted out.
Right. Right.
Uh,
Right.
but the thing that I'm haunted by are the parents who come to me after they've lost a child with so many regrets.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that tail wags the dog of what I advise people on the other side of it, which is leave it all on the field. Don't imagine 10 years from now the worst has happened and that you did everything you could humanly think of possible to avert that tragedy. And you'll be glad you did. And that's the best advice I could render.
Well, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a very pragmatic, it's a very clear step that parents or others can take. And it has some very good component parts in it. One reason why I find that suicide is so difficult among ordinary people, I'm not talking among clinicians now, is this issue of shame.
Yeah.
And it cuts into the issues about suicide in so many ways. And so I do want to talk about it a little bit right now, and then talk about it in relation to also family members recognizing that they may have a suicidal family member,
Yeah.
because then you can also feel ashamed of that. So now a lot of people that do act on, particularly young people, but I think as well there are older people who act on a suicidal impulse, act on it because they feel that there's something defective about themselves. It usually is in the sense of the self as a global sense, but it can also be in their bodies. Sometimes it's even an illness that they feel is incurable. And because of this, there's no solution from them in an ordinary way in life. And so the only solution would be to take themselves out of the game of life, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that sense that somehow the self cannot be fixed, that it's defective in some permanent way, is often overestimated by teens and young adults who are in that early stage of self-identification. And they overestimate what they believe is their knowledge about themselves, particularly about their flaws and their shortcomings. And then they might feel it's only logical. And I do hear this idea of logical very often.
Yeah, of course.
Um, only logical to kill themselves. And they may or may not show otherwise signs of depression. And they may or may not be in a situation where sometimes it's a very promising sort of straight A student at Middlebury College. So they don't show signs of having, no future.
Yeah.
So this idea of shame, I would just like to spend a few minutes talking about it from the point of view that the individual feels a defect rather than something that can be resolved. Like we can resolve our feelings of remorse or guilt, we can apologize, we can repair, we can turn to a different page.
Yeah.
But if we feel that there's something inherently defective in ourselves, and then also even in our families, we may want to cover up, instead of getting help, instead of seeing this as an ordinary human kind of issue, this idea of shame can snowball,
Yeah.
and it becomes a real problem for seeking help. Also, let's say, kind of normalizing the issues
Yeah.
that surround this problem. So I wonder what from your research, from your work with young adults or teenagers, or any of the work that you've done, how shame enters into your
Yeah,
thinking.
it's obviously a huge consideration. I had two associations as you were talking. One is that Roy Baumeister is a professor at Florida State University. He's probably emeritus at this point, but he wrote like one big paper in suicide that was seminal, and it was around self-hate and
Yeah.
escape. It's called the escape theory of suicide, and it's essentially a version of what you're exactly describing. Is that a intolerable inability to tolerate a way I feel about myself. Therefore, suicide escape is more desirable. Basically, I just can't stand me. And we do a lot of research on this. Self-hate, as we understand it, is pretty central in a lot of our multivariate analyses. It moderates overall risk in a very pronounced way. We actually have an intervention for suicidal self-hate that I could tell you about, but
Please. Yeah.
it's a very interesting thing. I mean, we do a exercise called mental time travel with suicidal self-hate. And we go back in time to the first time that you remember hating yourself. And when you attached that to I should kill myself.
Hmm.
And then we do it in the present, we do it in the future. And usually the one that goes back to the past is profound. And oftentimes we see tears and a lot of affective expression because it's this time when my father embarrassed me in front of my cousins and
Hmm.
seemed to delight in it. And I felt so awful that I felt like running in front of a car. And how old were you? I was 8 years old. And what do you make of that? Your reaction was to run in front of a car versus run away, or so in my intervention, we kind of go there. We go
Mm-hmm.
right to the genesis of that. My other association, so that's a whole piece, but my
Mm-hmm.
other association is Mark Williams at the University of Oxford. Again, he's now also, I think, retired, but seminal thinker in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Mark did a lot of work in suicide prevention, and he had this notion of this construct of entrapment.
Yeah.
And that, and I think a version of that might be very relevant to your audience in terms of what the pandemic is doing to us.
Right.
In terms of the social distancing, wearing of masks, literally separating ourselves from others outside of our bubble. And so there's been a lot of conjecturing about, we know the ideation is up. We know that mental health distress and alcohol, substance abuse is up. We don't yet know if the deaths are up. And in some countries, the deaths are actually down since the pandemic. We have a 2-year delay when our National Center for Health Statistics reports the data. So we don't necessarily know if the deaths are up, but we definitely know people are not doing well. And that's very clear. And as you noted at the start of the program, that young adults, people of color, people who are caring for people are especially having these recent serious suicidal thoughts. So that combination of not being able to tolerate the person that I experienced myself to be and being trapped, this entrapment notion, I think is a pretty lethal cocktail in terms of people getting into some pretty dire straits.
Yeah, I agree about that. And I think again that that sense that young adults can have of exaggerating their self-knowledge, that's there's a there was a recent movie about Jane Austen's life,
Yeah,
actually, and there was a scene in it. I don't know if you
I
remember
know
the
of it. I know what you're
you
referring to.
know it. And there's a scene where these two young people, the young man has fallen in love with a woman, and the woman has decided she'll never marry. And it's a wonderful scene because the two of them are telling each other, and they're about 20, how
Yeah,
they've recently discovered exactly who they are and exactly how their lives are going to be. And the man says, I'll die if I can't marry you, and you're the only person I will ever love. And the
yeah,
woman says, I will never marry. I want to devote myself to my writing, and so on. And then, 2 years later, it's completely different for the two of them.
yeah,
But that overestimation of self-knowledge that comes in near the end, I always think of sort of the 18 to 25-year-old period where the brain is finishing its maturation,
yeah,
is the time when that fingerprint of identity is going to come into your experience of yourself. You're going to say, well, this is who I am,
yeah.
and I'm going to be this way for the rest of my life.
Mhm.
And that's really a complete and utter delusion, but we all believe it
Yeah.
when we go through it.
Well, it's why I'm such a fan of mentalization, which you
Yes,
may be familiar with,
of course, yes.
Bateman and Fonagy's notion, Jeremy Holmes, others, that where you're looking at yourself from the outside
Yes,
and looking at others from the inside,
that's exactly right.
right?
Yes,
And so
yes.
and I would say that our intervention does a version of that. It sort of evokes, uh, it hits the pause button that I should kill myself, and tries to create this moment of mentalization
Mhm.
for the patient where they can look at themselves a little bit differently than they did when they first came in.
Yeah,
And of course, then the admonition for the clinician is to look at the patient differently than how they assume they are. And so if both parties are mentalizing, or their mirror neurons are both lit up, in the frontal lobes, that there's a different kind of therapeutic thing going on, because perspective is shifting.
yeah,
And in the shift of perspective, life has a chance. Where,
right,
as
right.
you're describing, sort of, what you're sort of describing, or alluding to, which I think is not uncommon. It's not epidemic,
Right.
it happens as it happens, is that people get into this sort of logic, or I call it psychological math, where, okay, this is what this and this all add up to, is that I should kill myself. It's
Right.
actually not a bad thing to do. I can end my suffering. I'll unburden my loved ones. I'm
Right.
such a pain in the neck to my parents and to my friends, that my death will be a gift.
Mhm.
And as you're saying, in the brain of a 17-year-old, that may be as true as anything they know.
Mhm.
But in reality, most people that care about them don't feel that way.
Of course not. Of course not. And I mean, and it may be in the brain of a 23-year-old too. I mean, just
That
in the
too.
same way you're putting it, because again, there's an exaggerated sense of what you're calling self-hatred. Is I would call it the sense of defect in myself.
Yeah,
And so, and this will be the way it will always be.
yeah,
And of course, it is not going to be that way always. But that sense of, now I see, this is who I am,
yeah,
and this is the problem.
Yeah.
And it's that space that does have to be mentalized. It has to be opened up. There has to be the possibility of seeing from different points of view. And, it might be especially difficult for a parent to
Yeah.
have that conversation, because the parent just wants to say, no, you're wonderful. I love
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
No, don't do that.
Well, and the net of that natural parental reaction, which I totally appreciate as a parent, is to invalidate that person's experience, that child's
Exactly.
experience,
Yes,
which
exactly.
is totally unintended. It's meant to just look at it this way, honey. This
Yeah,
is what's true. The way you're
right,
saying this is all wrong. So look at it this way. But in effect, you're saying, don't think this way.
right,
I
right.
don't permit you to think this way. And as an expert in shame, I think you would appreciate that that's a very invalidating and
Yes.
could be embarrassing and or they don't get it kind of perspective. I'll tell you, I had a very seminal experience that I'm associating to now, which is that I did a consultation at a very prestigious private school in DC a number of years ago. And the intervention was to go and meet with the parents in the evening and then talk to in this case, it was a boys' school in the morning, very famous, prestigious school that I'll remain nameless. And about 60 parents came to the evening, and I presented a teenage case, typical case in my practice, of a high achieving set of parents, great ambitions for their child, big investment in the sort of the DC professional culture. It was very, very sort of typical, prototypic family. And these parents were loving and caring, and their sort of plea with me is, why won't our boys talk to us? And I was like, well, let's talk about that and we'll sort of sort that out. Next morning, I go in and I meet with 500 teenage boys. The place it's on fire with adolescent, male hormones,
Right.
and I told the same case, and they were riveted. And at the end of the discussion, I had a trail of 50 kids who wanted to talk to me, and they had to go off to classes. And my takeaway from that was so distinct. And I bet you can guess where I'm going with this. Why don't our parents listen to us?
Yeah, exactly. Right,
And then I met with
right.
the teachers that afternoon, told the same case. And the teacher said, what are we going to do with all these crazy parents?
Yeah, yeah.
So
There's
it was just a snapshot of a little
right,
cultural perspective, I think, of exactly what you're asking about,
right,
which is that
right.
parents would do anything for their children, but the kids feel like they aren't really being listened to. And in that gulf lies the threat or the challenge
Mm-hmm,
of missing each other.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
why a program like this is so important potentially is to kind of think that through and think, how can I talk to my child in a way that's loving, that doesn't invalidate them?
Right, right. And
And
it's very difficult as a
it is.
parent with if your child is suicidal. I mean, there are many other things where it is possible and even difficult because your kid wants to go climb the Himalayas or whatever, and it scares you. But
Yep,
yes, it's possible to talk to them about their interest and set your own aside.
of course.
But on this issue,
It's too central.
it it is so I don't know that there is a parent out there. I mean, certainly not for me, where I could step aside on my self-interest of my kid actually being able to live and 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 really try smoothly to go into that space. Although, you know, many times parents are first responders in this situation. And I think just even knowing about the care package, knowing that there's a way of approaching a young person with some recognition that this young person is actually trying to reason this through, as difficult and delusional as it seems to be as a process of reasoning. This person has been thinking along these lines because they're feeling in so much pain, or they're feeling in so much shame, or they're feeling so much despair. So I mean, I think that it's very, very hard for the parent,
It is.
but that's where it really has to go.
Well, and that's why we're talking about it. If it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
easy, we wouldn't have the problem. But I think a lot about one of our clinical trials that we did in the Army, where we had our intervention and the control intervention. And they were conscientious, in this case, clinical social workers, 100% clinical social workers. And we characterized the control treatment as CBT, clinician bossy therapy.
Yeah,
And that's not what they would call it, but they would,
right.
but that's what we saw was like,
Yeah,
Paul, Polly, look at this. This is the way you should be thinking, right?
right.
You
Yeah.
know, and if you were to kill yourself, your wife would be without a husband and your kids would be
Mhm.
without a father. And you don't want to do that to them, right? And what we saw in our trial was that within like 15, 20 minutes of the first session, the soldier is like, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Yes. Because they've been
right.
shamed
That's
and
right.
admonished into, this is the way a normal, healthy person will look at it. You should just look at it this way. So just do that.
Mhm.
And you
That's
gotta
a
go,
really good example. Really good example.
not that
It's
simple.
yeah, and it's exactly where, again, many parents would go, and of course, it's also where many therapists would go too. And
Yeah.
so, yeah,
Because
so
because
that's a very good
because
example.
it's anxiety provoking.
Yes, exactly. So let's shift a little bit, and I want to ask you about why you got into this line of work. And I also want to say that I, though this really wasn't my motivator to become a therapist, it probably was one of them. That in my family, my father's mother died by suicide.
Mm,
And you taught me to say died by suicide instead of saying committed suicide. And I understand the
yeah,
nuance of
yeah,
that. And so my father was 10 years old. She was 34 years old when she died. And my father never spoke about it.
yeah,
And I would not have even known. He just said his mother died when she was young. And
yeah,
I knew that she was 34.
yeah,
And I would not have known how she died had his older brother not told me, when I was grown up, finally. I mean, he didn't when I was younger,
yeah,
but there was so much shame about this being suicide.
yeah,
And I realized that my father had borne this shame through his life and hadn't talked about it because I think in some way it seemed unspeakable,
yeah.
uh, at that period of time. And so I wonder also, for many of us in the mental health field, there are various reasons why we come into the profession. My father certainly had a pretty difficult emotional disorder that was probably related in part to this suicide.
Yeah.
But and that was one of my motivators for becoming a psychologist and then a psychoanalyst. From the time I was young, I was trying to figure out what was going on with my father. So I wondered if you have any personal motivators for being in the suicide prevention field, or maybe not, or but how did you start? What was it?
I started, I guess not really even really realizing it until we're sort of talking. I started this as a philosopher, actually. I was a philosophy major in college until my favorite philosopher pulled me aside and said, "Get out of philosophy. It's a dead end. It's a dead end," which crushed me at the time. But I had a love for philosophy and a love of existential philosophy and sort of philosophy of science and things like that, analytic philosophy. And then I was in graduate school trying to get into a doctoral program. So I was in a master's program, sort of as a means of getting competitive for a PhD program. And my psychopathology professor was an expert. He's now retired. Lanny Berman was my mentor in graduate school, and he was a very prominent suicide prevention person. So it was initially kind of a means to an end, and then, boy, as soon as I started like looking into the under the lid of that, it was just like everything for me.
Hmm,
It was philosophical. It was
right.
existential. It was about being alive and what does it mean to be alive and
What is the meaning?
what is
Hmm.
the meaning of life, as corny as
Right.
that sounds. And so
No.
it was a whole shebang. And I just got on fire with the power of it. My wife, her mother took her life when she was 14. I knew her since college, and we would get together when I was in graduate school, and we would have these wonderful dinners. She'd come into town, and it wasn't until like 3 or 4 years after our sort of spending time together, she said, "Did I ever tell you about how my mother died?" And I was like, "Oh my God," I had no
Hmm.
idea. So I felt really suddenly very embarrassed about my talking so academically about suicide. But she's always had a very interesting way of looking at it, and I think a very healthy way of looking at it, that, her mother was, she couldn't just make it in this world. And she sees her as her guardian angel, and has actually a really lovely lived experience, survivor loss story that I think makes sense to her. And I think anybody that loses someone special like that has to create some kind of narrative to make sense of it, because it's such a horrific thing.
Yeah, yeah, it really is.
And as a 13-year-old girl, to lose your mother is just sort of unthinkable. But she integrated it in a way that made sense. But my children will never know their grandmother.
Yes, 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 yes.
So
Well, they know, but they know the story of their grandmother.
they do, because
Your wife
were
was
open.
able to integrate it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now their cousins didn't know, and found out through our kids, just like in your family story.
Yeah.
But I think what I found quite quickly was I entered this into kind of an intellectualized kind of way, and then went into therapy myself at the time, and was in this sort of synergy of therapy and supervision. And my earlier work was mostly psychodynamic, and I was, really growing and learning so much. And so my research moved from sort of the esoteric into the clinical, and really kind of went sort of deeper and delved into the phenomenology and the etiology and the genesis of these states. And for 20 years, basically, I did assessment research. And then I quite literally, published a bunch of papers and was really fascinated with that. And I quite literally was confronted at a conference by Marshall Linehan saying, this is lovely, but we need treatment. And you need to become a treatment researcher, because assessment only is half the story.
So, I'm interested in one tiny thing, and I don't want to leave it, even though it's a little bit of a sidebar. I have never heard a philosopher recommend not going into philosophy. So I'm just curious. I mean, I have a background in philosophy also.
I know you do.
I'm just curious where that was, what college, and you don't have to tell me the philosopher.
I was at the University of Colorado. It has a very robust philosophy department. I had John Searle, who's this very famous analytic philosopher.
Of course, I love John
speech
Searle.
acts. Yeah, and so he came in from Berkeley because he wanted to go skiing for a semester. So, I had amazing philosophy professors, but this one really particular, I can't remember what his area was, but he was just, he's this English guy. He trained at Cambridge, and he's just like, it's a dying field. Get out of it. But it was the best advice possible, because I was able to retain my interest and fascination with that right to the present day.
Exactly.
But then find really my niche in the applied aspects of of psychology and clinical psychology in particular. So I'm very grateful for that lineage, and it influences me right to the present day.
Well, I mean, it was just interesting to me because I also think of the issues that surround suicide, or that surround any kind of inquiry into life and death. Those are the deepest philosophical issues.
Right.
And yet, philosophers back away from the pragmatics of them. Yeah. And they get into essentially this abstract kind of inquiry. But so it is, I mean, it was just interesting to me that a philosopher told you that directly, because it was accurate. It was definitely accurate. And I started out in medieval studies, and I was interested in medieval philosophy. And, and the world I'm in now is like the opposite of being, if I'd remained, well, medieval studies became more interesting after postmodernism affected medieval studies also. But in any case, I'm glad you came this way. I'm glad I came this way into psychology, because it is a more lively engagement with the issues,
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you about the suicide prevention lab at Catholic University. So if you would tell listeners how it's set up, what you do there, and the people that you train, and also the research you do, so we can get a picture, and then we're going to go into the CAMs.
Yeah. So Suicide Prevention Lab is my, like, one of my favorite things. We have about 25, 30 young people, mostly young people, who make up the lab. We have I'm sort of at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, and then I've got PhD students in their first, second, third, and fourth years, who are members of the lab, and they're at different stages of their training, both clinically and in terms of research. And then we've got a tier of master students who are mostly trying to get into doctoral programs. And then we've got a raft of undergraduates who are research assistants. And so the second year PhD students, I take 2 a year because I have funding for research, and they run the lab. And so my job is to sort of get the grants and get access to populations and to sort of be the rainmaker. And then the senior PhD students are advisors to the second years. The first years are apprentices to the second years who are running things. And then the master students have like a tier of research that's going on. And then the undergrads are entering data and doing coding. So later today, for example, we have a lab meeting on Zoom where the entire lab is going to code treatment plans from a recent randomized controlled trial to look at the content of the problems that we're treating. And and this is where like the least experienced member of the lab, an undergraduate who's just joined the lab, who's like totally like, what is this I got myself into, to my more senior PhD students who I've published papers with. Everybody's got a valuable perspective because we do a lot of qualitative work. In this case, we're just going to kind of code the content categories of the problems that the people that we study say compel them to think about suicide. And so so that's a lab-wide project. We kind of floundered last semester trying to figure out how to do online research because everything literally is in this big space that we have in the basement of my building. But I can't impress upon you sort of the joie de vivre, that sort of the spirit that this group has, because we really feel like we're saving lives and we feel like our work is making a difference. And when you see like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old who's, new to this, or 20-year-old, and they sort of get it, and they're on fire with what we can do. I've had people come in as a freshman, go all the way through all 4 years, get into, get a placement at NIH, which is just on the road, and then get into a PhD program, and now are out in the field. And, those students that have found that bug, like I found it, are just treasures to me, and they're making a difference in the world. So
And you're doing double-blind randomized studies now using CAMS, is it?
Yeah.
Or just if you could tell people a little bit, where you're doing those, what the populations are, and then we'll go into what CAMS is.
Yeah. So what we're mostly doing, we kind of do everything under the sun. You'll probably be interested to hear, we have a whole nother line of work that I'm talking about later tonight with one of my PhD students about a post-suicidal life and what makes life worth living once you've been suicidal and you're attaching from death and attaching to life. So we branch off and do different things. We've studied rock music lyrics that have been provocative. We do all kinds of things under the broad umbrella. But what we're really sort of the bread and butter, 90% of what we do is randomized controlled trials, where our job is mostly to be a subcontract to different RCTs. We're watching videos, and we're watching videos to make sure that the clinicians in the experimental arm of the clinical trial, the randomized controlled trial, are doing CAMS adherently. And that the comparison, are they not doing CAMS, or they're not doing DBT, for example? And that's fidelity. So we do adherence and fidelity checks.
I see.
And what's cool about that is that the graduate students get to watch these videos and rate them, and they learn a lot about psychotherapy, and they learn a lot about suicidal states. And then when they apply for internship, they're like, I was on a RCT, and I was consulting with licensed providers about how to do this intervention. And so they get a really rich experience.
It sounds wonderful, actually, from the perspective of the richness of it and the multiple levels. And so now that you mentioned the study of rock music, I mean, I've always wondered, like, if Kurt Cobain, or if various lyrics in rock music or in hip hop music, do they actually compel kids?
Well, we've done,
or do they not? I mean, do
yeah,
you
well,
know?
we did a study on Cobain. We did a study on Cobain's death. Some colleagues of mine at the CDC did actually an interrupted time series analysis, which was before and after Cobain's death. And we actually saw a drop in suicides in King County, which is where Cobain lived in Seattle, and an increase in calls to the hotline. And it was a very, at a time in the 90s, it was a very famous, quote unquote famous little F there, study where I interviewed a bunch of places and so forth, because it was a very sort of striking finding. We then did a series of very rigorous experiments looking at Metallica and Stabbing Westward and different bands that, emo music, bands that would use suicidal lyrics. And what we found was really interesting, which was that suicide lyrics could put the topic of suicide on the minds of a naive listener. But it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Some would feel like an increased concern for others. Some would feel like my life isn't so bad compared to the lead singer, in this provocative song. And so it was actually at the time when Tipper Gore was trying to put warning labels on albums. This is really dating myself. But it was interesting because our experimental data was that you could put this on the mind, not of everybody, just certain people who had kind of a vulnerability to being influenced by this, but that the net of it as we studied it was mostly pro-social. So
that's
that was
interesting.
Counterintuitive. And that was just sort of a side note. We did it with emo music and got nothing. So it depends on the genre of music, apparently. But
right. Or probably the people that are attracted to that genre. I mean, that's interesting to me too, because I know that there was a similar kind of study done with violence and Grand Theft Auto, which is the video game. And they found out that really the results are pretty pro-social. I mean, contrary to what you would think, actually, and it may go back to some of what we were talking about earlier, that the engagement with the topic is actually a positive thing.
Well, there's a directionality issue, for getting methodological. Is it that violence causes people to become violent, or do violent people watch violent things?
Right.
And so if it's a well-done experiment, you can actually tease out that causality. But for us, it was that, we can definitely put this on the minds of young people, college students, but it isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so even like now, there's no question in my mind that people are thinking about suicide more now, but I'm not convinced it's not necessarily going to lead to more attempts and completions. We'll see in a couple of years. But just, and I want both ways on that. Ideation is very worrisome to me, and I think we tend to trivialize ideation, but it doesn't necessarily translate into behavior, and that's kind of what we're keeping a close eye on.
Well, just as you're saying that, also, I realized that the parents that I work with in therapy, and of course, these are usually moms, and I'm usually seeing them in individual therapy. Maybe one of the reasons why this topic is up so often is that their kids are sounding this way, but they're not acting on it. So then the conversation maybe is being had at home. Maybe there is conversation about, have you thought about this, etc. So this could be an opportunity. I mean, again, this is trying to turn everything upside down. Being stuck at home is not a great thing for young people. No question about it. But then there is more relationality perhaps within the family as a result of this. So, possibly you're right that there won't be the increased deaths. It'll be more the attempts or the ideation.
I'm 62, and I try to not be sort of old and stuck in my ways. So I try to really be open to the alternative of what like people my age typically might do. And so, for example, going telehealth or teaching online. I mean, clearly politically, it's a very hot topic, and I think for children it's a disaster. But at the college level, I've taught some awesome classes this year, even with a class as big as 60 people last semester. And it was definitely different. And I definitely had to sort of learn to use Zoom in a clever way. But in some ways, it was actually different, better in ways that I would not have expected. And I think the same thing is happening in teletherapy, is that there's a lot, and we're studying this. So I'm not going to jump the data.
Right.
But there are presumptions that this is not as good and the quality of the alliance can't be as intimate and so forth. And I think I have lots of anecdotes, and we're going to have data here pretty soon to say, actually, that may not be true for everybody. And for some people, it's better. And so I think it's best to be open
Yeah,
and
yeah, it is.
not
That's
presumptive.
true. I mean, I don't love doing it though, I have to say. It's a little hard on my eyes by the end of the day.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, so
I do.
let's go now to what CAMS is
Okay.
and what's unique about it, and also why it's important for therapists and counselors to to engage. Well, we've already really talked about that, but to engage with the suicidal topics rather than pulling back and
Yeah.
being afraid of the liabilities, etc. So if you would just let's talk about CAMS, let's talk about what it does, where it is, where it's going.
Yeah.
And I sort of see it as a cultural movement and not just an assessment. So
Well, I have pitched as a philosophy and as a
mhm.
framework. So my philosophical roots have not departed completely. I would say it harkens back to our earlier conversation where we were talking about, sort of this idea of the therapist voyeur versus the therapist participant. And, I used to be just like, so just develop empathic fortitude and get in there and, and sort of go into that space and don't be afraid. And that wasn't carrying the day. Clinicians were like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. So long story short, I was doing a lot of assessment work on this instrument called the suicide status form, which was originally developed in the counseling center at my university. And then I moved over to the faculty full time, but we kept on studying the suicide status form. And there were various quantitative assessments. And then we started getting qualitative responses, reasons for living, reasons for dying, rate your psychological pain. Then what do you find most painful? And lo and behold, people would tell us really valuable, interesting things. And then I had this moment with Marcia where she kind of like, quite literally, she was like, you have to become a treatment researcher and I'm going to make you do it. And she is a force of nature and I couldn't say no. And so what CAMS was emerged in this sort of interesting way as a certain way of administering the suicide status form. So when I was first hired at the university, I was hired to train the Rorschach ink blot test, which is famous or infamous depending on your perspective. But as you probably know, Paul, that the idea was that you sit next to the patient and you present these ink blots that don't actually look like anything.
Right.
And the person gives their perceptions, and then you go through a second time the inquiry to actually score it. And the inquiry is really critical because it's usually the form or the color or different things about it that creates the percept.
By the way, I love it. I love the work.
I've always loved it, and I love its history. I love that it was a parlor game in sort of upper Swiss society.
Oh, right.
That Hermann Rorschach converted into an assessment tool at his hospital. But I loved the spirit of that because what the patient saw is what carries the day. Right. So the clinician doesn't tell the patient what they see.
Right.
With all their clever training, that they create a vehicle by which the patient can reveal parts of who they are.
Right.
And so the SSF became this collaborative assessment. And so we would use the suicide status form, kind of like an ink blot, so to speak, for the patient to unpack what it means for them to be suicidal. So the phenomenology piece was still very much in play for me. It always has been, always will be. And people could rate quantitatively, and we could do psychometrics and validity and reliability checks on that. But the written responses were what were kind of novel. And patients found that to be very validating, where they could be supported in sort of unloading their story, their narrative, the nature of their struggle. And then we asked about risk and warning signs. And I'll have you know that Marcia, when I was first developing this for our first RCT, said, you got to add shame. You got to add shame as the final variable in what we call the risk and warning signs section. And sure enough, it's the final variable that we sort of like look over everything. And now as you reflect on this, do you have a sense of shame or not? You tell me about that. And we sort of note that. And then the nature of it was I had done all this assessment work and knew a lot about the suicidal mind, but I didn't know how to treat it. And so that's where CAMS really was born, was iteratively to treat what makes this person that's now revealed the nature of their struggle. And the really signature piece of CAMS is we develop a stabilization plan, which other people have, Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown and David Rudd and Craig Bryan, different kinds of ways of the not a no harm contract, but what you will do should you become destabilized or have a dark moment. But the signature piece of CAMS I'm probably most proud of in some ways is that we would say to a suicidal person, why do you want to kill yourself?
Right.
And we call these in the model drivers, and the drivers are what we target and treat.
Yeah.
And so, as not lost on you probably, the drivers that we hear about are relationships, and they are how I feel about myself. They are about what I do or who I am. They're these very psychotherapy-rich constructs that we treat with whatever methods we know to treat. And whether that's psychoanalysis or that's medication or couples therapy, we kind of kitchen sink it and treat those problems with the things that we know that are effective, either by experience or by the evidence base. And so that's the long and the short of it. The first session is a very deep dive in sort of who, what, where, how, why are you suicidal? Can we keep you out of the hospital? But to keep you out of the hospital, we have to develop a stabilization plan that's unique that you'll use in a crisis, not the least of which is when you're going to reach out for help, maybe contact me, for example, after you tried other things to regulate or get control. And then meanwhile, in the sessions, we're going to target and treat your self-hatred and your trauma history.
Yeah.
And for that, we're going to do insight work and behavioral activation and some cognitive therapy and maybe some prolonged exposure. And what happens, in that first session when we are going through the treatment plan together, and I start saying, well, okay, Paula, for your problem drivers, we can do this, we can do this, there. Oftentimes, you're watching the video, you can see the clients say, "Really, you can treat these?" Sure.
Right.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to treat these things.
Right.
Whether they work for you and save your life or not, that I don't know. But yeah, we'll take a whack at it. Why wouldn't we? And this is where a lot of motivational interviewing are different kind of paradoxical interventions or counterprojection, whatever you want to call, enters the picture where I say, it's not for me to decide that you can't kill yourself, but why would you kill yourself before you engage in life-saving treatment?
Yes, exactly. Right. And I actually think that it's a little hard to tease all this out, but it is often the case that that person who's feeling suicidal didn't actually believe there was something that could be done about these things, especially if it's a young person.
Yeah.
That it hasn't really actually entered their mind. And so to say, well, of course we can do something about this, and and then we can check and see how you feel.
Yeah.
That hasn't entered their mind. And it's partly because I think in that mind, that suicidal mind, there's a kind of a logic that is focused on this solution.
Yeah.
And again, it's an overdone logic, and especially if it's adolescent or young adult logic, it has a feeling, like when I've treated older people who are suicidal, particularly people who are in, let's say, over their 60s, sort of in their 60s and 70s, in that age range.
Yeah.
They are actually more reflective about the whole thing. The younger person is more determined because they believe they know already. So putting that moment in, oh yes, you could do this. This is, I see exactly how that is different and can work.
Well, so we think the secret sauce is in that first session because it's collaborative, we're empathic, we're validating, we're suicide focused, and then we make a pitch. Give us 12 sessions.
Right.
You get to be dead forever. So what's your hurry?
Yeah. Right.
So it's a pragmatic sort of motivational interviewing kind of thing where we say everything to gain, nothing to lose. You get to be dead, and the question is now or later, and I would advocate for later. And so we then do interim care where we're treating drivers, right? So we keep on assessing every session, and we end with a treatment plan update. And the drivers sometimes evolve. The problems, it might be that I will never have a girlfriend. And then in session 5, I'll never have a girlfriend because every time I get in a relationship, I screw up the intimacy because lo and behold, I was sexually abused when I was a little boy. So we call that sharpening the driver. We've sort of gotten more to the root of what's at the heart of your suicidal struggle, and we can shift the treatment accordingly. And then we have criteria for resolution, which is not exorcism of any vestige of suicidal thoughts. It's that you're managing the thoughts and feelings and you're behaviorally stable. And so that's the model. It's got a clear beginning, a clear middle, clear end. The SSF is the roadmap that guides it. Interestingly enough, from a liability standpoint, that's the best way to protect yourself, is to have thorough documentation. Even more than evidence-based treatment, the documentation is what is the tail that wags the dog of malpractice tort litigation. So it may not be right, but it's the way our system works, is that if you have excellent records and you were thorough and thoughtful about the assessment and treatment and didn't drop the ball, you're not going to be sued for malpractice. So what's cool about CAMS in this way is that a lot of that documentation is done in session.
Yeah, I hear it. It. It's a whole sort of format where the documentation is part of the therapy.
And the patient gets a copy of their SSF, or they take a picture with it on their phone. So there's no, we pull back the curtain of treatment, and demystify it. And then we do randomized control trials of this model, and we've got now 5 published RCTs with different populations, and that's kind of what we do in my lab.
And so tell me what the outcomes have been like, and then I want to ask you a little bit about also some age and cultural differences in these some of the so go ahead though and tell me first about your outcomes.
Well, we have replicated outcomes, independent replication, so it's empirically validated for suicidal ideation. We can reduce suicidal ideation about 6 to 8 sessions across. There's a meta-analysis now of 9 studies, and so we found a very robust effect for reducing ideation across 9 studies. We see symptom distress, and you allude to this in the introduction, being reliably reduced across 9 studies. The most robust meta-analytic finding is increasing hope and decreasing hopelessness, which I love as a finding. And then we see better adherence, and we see mixed data on self-harm and attempt behaviors. And so this is that's what I was this is a particular soapbox of mine, because the field is very preoccupied with attempt behaviors, and I've had papers for our clinical trials rejected because it only reduced ideation. And my response is, like, only ideation, that's 12 million American adults. Add in the teenagers and the kids, and we're talking 14 million with serious SAMHSA data, serious suicidal thoughts in the last 30 days. And yet we're just going to focus on the 47,000 that die by suicide, or the 1.6 million that make attempts. It makes me think about other disorders in our field, Polly, where, OCD, if you're decreasing obsessions, big clinical win, even if there's no behavior change in the compulsions. But in suicide, this just decreasing ideation without change is, that's not that big a deal.
So is that I mean, how do I want to say it? Can you give me a sort of comparison between your method and other? I mean, I don't know if there's anything else better on the block. I mean,
well, dialectical behavior therapy is better, but it's much more complex.
Well, it's a different kind of approach. I mean,
DBT has the best data for attempt behavior and self-harm.
Oh, but a particular population typically, though, too. I mean, it's not across.
Mostly female borderline patients. Yeah,
that's right.
So that's a ding on DBT. There's 2 forms of suicide-specific cognitive therapy called cognitive therapy for suicide prevention, 10 sessions, and brief cognitive behavioral therapy, or BCBT. And those are very effective at reducing attempt behaviors. But what's interesting about DBT and these cognitive therapy interventions that are suicide-focused and effective is they don't necessarily reduce ideation.
Oh, interesting.
Where CAMS always reduces ideation.
So do they follow, I mean, again, I'm not familiar with this research, but are there lifelong follow-ups to, say, the outcome with DBT or that CBT variation? I mean, I wonder, do
It's too
they just,
expensive. You get about a year to 2-year follow-up, and
so there's nothing like a whole sort of lifetime study
no, it's too
of,
expensive.
yeah, I would think it would be, but what I wonder about, of course, is what's the future of that individual. I mean, I do a lot of couples therapy, and so I look at the findings for EFT, and they look good when the couple is finishing the therapy. But I've seen so many of those couples later with no gains in skills, and so you don't know. And like you say, if the ideation changes, is this going to actually contribute to the person long term
Yeah.
being able to cope with?
Yeah, we're trying to change the conversation on this one. So
Yeah,
there are two things. One is that we wrote a paper a year or two ago called "One Size Doesn't Fit All."
yeah,
So it's a paper that basically says there are very good treatments for attempt behaviors. There's very good treatments for, and those are DBT, CBT, those two different CBTs. There's very good treatments for chronic borderline suicidal risk with multiple attempts. That would be DBT. But for the ideation group, there's CAMS. And that's the iceberg of the suicide problem. The tip is the attempt and completion issue, but the 14 million who are underwater are the
yeah,
ones who are struggling with serious suicidal thoughts. So we're trying to change a bit of the conversation in that way, and saying we need to, in the UK, you can get DBT, but only if you make an attempt.
oh,
So otherwise, you just get supportive counseling, which
I
doesn't work.
see.
So
Yeah,
so there's the national health system that's essentially like conditioning people to ramp up to a behavior, so
yeah.
they get an evidence-based intervention. Makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. No, no, no,
So
no.
that's kind of what we're after, is saying, CAMS doesn't work for everybody, but if we were better with ideators who are newer at
Yeah,
being suicidal, they wouldn't go on to attempt and then complete.
right, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think that in the mental health field at least, but maybe in general, we are going to have to get more refined in understanding suicide,
Oh yeah,
because it isn't just a sort of,
unitary
it's
thing.
not, yeah, it's not a unitary thing. It's like trying to understand depression. People say, well, I have depression. Well, so what? I mean, everybody has some depression. I mean, depression is not some particular thing, and suicide is not some particular unitary thing.
Yeah.
And it seems like CAMS has, and at least in my, sort of understanding of it, refined the inquiry. It's refined the
We
inquiry.
have a therapeutic assessment that is patient-centered, and then we treat what the patient tells us makes them want to kill themselves. And that's
Right.
very unique and special about CAMS. The cognitive therapy approaches have what Dr. Beck refers to as the suicidal mode. So
Mm,
they can map out the mode, and what's your mode is different than my mode, that's different than the next patient's mode. But there are certain affects and cognitions and behaviors and physiology that kick in with the mode. So as a cognitive therapist, you're treating the mode.
hmm. And
Um,
what is meant by mode there? I'm not, again,
I
I'm
should
not a
kill myself.
cognitive.
I
Oh,
should kill
okay.
myself.
That
I'm
mode.
bumping
Okay.
along, I'm doing fine, and then something
Right.
triggers me, and I have some memories, and now I
Mm,
get worked up, and then I go back in Facebook to talk to my ex-girlfriend, and all of a sudden, everything's sort of
hmm.
on fire, and I think I should kill myself.
I
And
see.
so
I see.
so what I would say is that all the effective interventions essentially do the same thing. They teach a suicidal person to become their own suicidologist.
Mm, yeah.
They
Yeah.
teach the suicidal person that I'm in trouble, and I'm getting upset, and this could end up in a lethal outcome. And that sort of that thing I alluded to earlier about limbic dysregulation
Yeah.
and frontal lobe being offline, the interventions that we do, like a safety plan or a app-based intervention,
Right.
re-engage the frontal lobe
That's
to,
right.
to down-regulate. So I think
Yeah.
the mechanisms are actually quite similar across the effective treatments, and that's cool. And if we had
Mhm.
like a $50 million grant, we could put people in the magnet and watch them before and after treatment, show how their brains light up differently, and study the neurology of it. But I think that's really what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, I'm not a big fan of study the neurology of it either, because actually I've seen so many of the mindfulness FMRs and fMRIs,
Yeah.
and So what? I mean, really what you have to study is the people and
Yeah.
what they do. And, a longitudinal study would help a great deal. A population study would help a great deal. But like you said, those are very expensive. But it seems to me that the CAMS approach may be a little bit like the psychodynamic approach versus the CBT approach versus the DBT approach to therapy. There's a match for different kinds of people. Not every person is going to do well with one particular approach. Not every person is a cookie, and so you don't need a
Yeah.
cookie cutter. So
It's one of the things I've always appreciated about the analysts is that I think psychoanalysts, this is a broad generalization, are honest about what they do and what they don't do.
yes, yes.
And that is, I think, ethical and proper. I'm a fan of the concept, at least, of Ron Kessler's notion of machine learning precision treatment rules,
Mm,
where you can use big data sets to create algorithms to route people to treatments for whom they're best suited to be
yes,
effective
yes, yes,
and
yes,
save a ton of money
yes,
from
yes,
trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You find
yes.
a square hole for a square peg and a round hole for a round peg.
Well, I
And
started my career with Jane Lovinger at Washington University in ego development. I was one of her research assistants, and then I did my dissertation under her, which was, excuse me, but very tough.
yeah,
But she was an incredible researcher, and the ego development scale was really a scale of different kinds of subjectivities, and it became
I love that.
a very good matching tool
Yeah,
for different kinds of therapies. The problem was at that point it couldn't be computerized. I don't even know now if it has been, actually, because it was so complex to score it at the upper
yeah,
stages of development. You needed to have a group of people have a discussion about the
yeah,
responses. But basically, it's exactly the idea, and I'd forgotten that Kessler did do that, where you could match the subjectivity of the individual to a type of therapy, and that is going to be a good match. And it can't be matched across all adults, for example. What's going to be an effective therapy? And
yeah.
I would say it probably is the same for something like suicide, which is actually a complex, unique kind of thing for each individual. And that's what CAMS is trying to do, is to work with that. And I didn't know it originated in the Rorschach thinking,
Well, I certainly
because
was influenced by it. And one of the things I think is kind of entertaining, you'll probably find this humorous. In Denmark, where CAMS is very popular, they're very psychoanalytically oriented.
right.
And so in fact, our lead trainer there is a psychoanalyst that a very dear friend of mine. And they when we watch videos, we're looking at he's translating in my ear. I remember a video. A man's wife was going to leave him, and he couldn't get a job, and that's why he had to kill himself. And so they're talking, and I said, well, what about like couples therapy? And they're like, and what about like vocational counseling? Oh, you Americans are always trying to fix things. I said, yeah, what are you trying to do? Well, we're talking about things.
Huh,
We talk about
interesting.
it. We
Yeah,
talk about, for them,
yeah,
everything was you talk about it because insight to them
yeah, yeah,
is the key.
yeah,
And they love the model. Where
yeah.
back here in the States, it's a much more CBT, cognitive therapy sort of approach. And then in China, they love it too. I mean, so I'm
Mm,
not saying it's universal, but it's got more flexibility because it's not a new psychotherapy. Clinicians can do what they know to do.
yes,
They don't have to become a behavior therapist. They don't have to become
right,
a cognitive therapist. They can do what they know to do to treat problem
right.
drivers. And that seems to be something that clinicians like, is not being told what to do.
So yes, yes. So let's go back to the drivers, just because I have one or two kinds of questions that are big questions for me, and I hadn't thought of these in advance. But I don't know if you've read or know about Richard Nesbitt's "The Geography of Thought,"
Mm.
which is about the difference in the mindset between Asians and Westerners. I mean, he's really looking at the Greeks and the Chinese as the backdrop.
Yeah.
And I have, because I'm a long time Buddhist practitioner, and I've been in Japan, and I've treated Japanese people who've come to the States to actually go through therapy.
Yeah.
And in regard to suicide, especially, is a different mindset. Shame and honor
Oh yeah.
are actually categories for the whole family. And so I wonder if you've seen cultural differences
Oh God,
on
yes.
drivers and what those are, if you can just do a quick
Yeah,
kind of sense
it's so interesting. In Denmark, they hate the construct of self-hate. They find it offensive. So when they train it, they say, "Well, it was developed by an American." But oh, okay, that makes sense. You know, that's how they train it. Is they
Yeah.
just sort of like say they put an asterisk, American made, and they're like, "Oh, well, of course it's American made."
Yeah.
In China, we've seen a big uptick there. They're very interested in psychoanalysis in China.
Yeah, I know. I know. I know a lot of people who are teaching online to the
It's
Chinese.
striking, you know, the
Yeah.
passion for it there. But they love CAMs. We have a collaboration with a group called in Tianjin University, which is just southeast of Beijing. The drivers are almost exclusively achievement and family.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just like you can almost set your watch to it, and
Yeah.
so you know it's very much consistent with that. And then I'll say in Australia, we've had some pushback around the notion of shame.
Hmm.
Because for Aboriginal populations who didn't
Oh,
exist as a statistic in their
yeah.
census until the 70s, there's this incredible culture of being non-people and
Hmm.
horrible treatment of the original natives of the continent. And so I don't know if you've been to Australia lately. I
No.
haven't lately, but I've been there a few times. Before every like presentation or conference, there is a long acknowledgement, and basically it's a apology for the wrongs of our ancestors to displace the rightful heirs of this country, and it's a very genuine reparation kind of statement.
Hmm.
So for them, shame is somehow wrapped up in that.
Wow.
So we've got some
Interesting.
pushback from people that work with Aboriginal populations saying there's this big reactivity to the construct of shame. So they just don't ask it. I mean, they just leave it off.
Hmm.
So we've seen, you know, I trained in Uruguay. We've seen a lot of use in Lithuania and Latvia, where there's a very high suicide rate, the Eastern European countries. And without overstating it, it has a kind of flexibility and cultural sensitivity that I think has been nice. When I did a training for the Navajo out in New Mexico years ago, they were thrilled that they could use native medicine and
Hmm.
ritual to
Yes.
treat drivers. They didn't have to use white
Yes.
man medicine or medication.
Yes.
And I was like, of
Yes.
course not. Why would we impose that
Right.
on your people? You've got an
Right.
astronomical suicide rate, have had for the history of keeping the data. Do what you know works for your people and the problems that are unique to your culture.
Wow. That's really kind of wonderful to hear all of that, even to conceptualize it. And also, you know, the idea of achievement and family, and also sometimes achievement for one's family.
Oh, of
You
course.
know, the idea of the self in Asia is very often a group self. It's not the individual like it
Right.
is in the West. And so that notion that you're bringing something to your family is so important. And when I was at Washington University, which is where I did my doctorate, I was did my my practicum and then actually part of my internship at the counseling center there. And the first suicide that I was involved in, it was not somebody that I was seeing in therapy, but when we were doing a group supervision kind of thing, it was a Japanese young man, as I recall, he was around 19, who had actually died by suicide because he had failed organic chemistry.
Yeah.
I mean, and to unpack that in the group for us, you know, as young Westerners, we found it almost impossible to understand. And it's only over my lifetime that I have come to look back at that.
Yeah.
And now I believe I completely understand it. At the
Yeah.
time, it didn't make sense to me,
Yeah.
you know, but those kinds of differences in regard to why somebody would want to kill themselves are again, philosophically, they're extremely important because you begin to understand what it is that we value in life,
Yeah.
what we consider to be the purpose of life, and then also how we conceive the self. Is the self just me inside of this body, or is it my family or the home that I live in? Or there are many issues that come into it.
Well, that's the paradox that I'm now sort of facing. I'm on sabbatical next year, and I'm writing a third edition of my Guilford book, which is going to be the last edition of the CAM series. And one of the things I would observe that I think is going to be very interesting to you is that we have seen that we can get people unsuicidal, but they don't know how to live.
Interesting. Tell me a little more there, what you mean by
So,
that.
so the construct is called a post-suicidal life, and it's this very profound. Marsha Linehan has been talking about a life worth living for 30
Mhm.
years, but DBT does not operationalize how you have a life worth living.
I know. I've seen a lot
And
of DBT people in therapy.
right,
Yes.
and TED Talks, is forever featuring people
Right.
who have the meaning of life all figured out. And for suicidal people, I'm being a little facetious, but also saying that
Right.
with respect. I mean, for people who have gone figuratively or literally to the edge and have said, well, I'm not going to die this way. And to uncouple themselves from that, to take the risk to hope and live is a profound thing.
Yeah.
And we've had soldiers, and we've had college students, and we've had
Yes.
community mental health patients, and different samples in Norway and Denmark and in the UK. We're looking at sort of these transcendental things about intentionality, about what is the meaning of life.
Hmm.
Um, I love simple constructs around balance.
Hmm.
Not that we're going to create a whole nother meta psychology, or I'm not in my career. I'm gonna retire before then. But to think about a post-suicidal life is really quite a profound thing. And I'll write a chapter in my book next year about the notion, and sort of what do we think are the ingredients of pursuing a life with purpose and meaning.
Well, I think that issue is one that people are constantly reviewing, especially through the life cycle,
I agree.
especially after they retire, even because, again, this is a group of people that now I'm seeing. And during this COVID shutdown, those people who are retired from what was really a busy profession are finding it difficult because they can't travel, that they can't do a bunch of things. And
Right.
so, what's the purpose of life? But one thing I was thinking of when you were saying that, wasn't there a study? Now, this is the way I remember it, that people who jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge and lived, that they were interviewed, and that there was a sequence for them as they were falling, because they had then that sort of expansive sense of time
Yeah.
to review. And it seems to me, I remember that every one of them wanted to live if
That's
if they lived the jump, if they
Yeah,
survived
that's
the
Richard
jump.
Seiden's work. It's a classic paper in the field. About 82 or 86% of them regretted
Regretted.
having left the bridge as soon as they did it. A subset of them, small, maybe 12, 15%, were frustrated it didn't work.
I
So
see.
that's quite a profound thing. We had a patient we have a VA study that's going on in San Diego, and one of my former students, who's now a fellow there, had this veteran who had a very distressed period over the holidays, just this recent holiday period, and had a toxic roommate, and his girlfriend left. He got a gun, put a bullet in the gun, put it to his head, pulled the trigger, and the bullet was a dud.
Wow. Wow.
Which from a manufacturing standpoint is
Rare.
very rare. I want to look it up actually to see what actuarially the chances of a dud bullet are. But this has been for him a profound thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's doing cams with him, and they are on fire. I mean,
Yeah.
he's taking notes during sessions. I've been coaching on the supervision consultation side of it, and we're sending him stuff to read.
Hmm.
He is on fire because he feels like he's been given a second chance.
Well, and there are many people that have that experience in surviving a terrible illness, who actually have this sense that now they have a profound meaning to that somehow God or somehow karma or something was involved in allowing them to live. And, obviously it's possible to contact that vitality without almost losing your life. But I think we're not very clear about what is that vitality. Is it something that is entirely just by chance that you feel it or you don't?
Yeah.
Or can you cultivate it? I truly believe it can be cultivated. I mean, I know in my own life and have gone through. My late husband died from early onset Alzheimer's, and so I had a 10-year period of watching him decline, and it was well, it's even hard to put it into words. I wrote a memoir about it, but it was remarkable to me that I kept being able to discover more and more meaning during that decline, which was more like his self was being erased.
Yeah.
But because of various circumstances, and he was in a good care center eventually, he also became happier and happier until the last 2 months, which
Yeah.
was awful.
Yeah.
But it's just that there is something about the meaning and purpose of life that is not dependent on your situation. But most people can't access that easily.
I
And
agree.
so, they when they get caught up in a situation that looks hopeless, feels hopeless, tastes hopeless, then they feel that there's nothing left. And if there were a way to discover or to hear about, the post-suicidal life, it's very reminiscent for me of people whose spouses have died, to have a new investment in life, particularly a beloved spouse. There has to be a new chapter. You
Well,
can't say that.
there's the notion
Yeah.
of post-traumatic growth. I mean,
Yes.
post-traumatic growth is one of my former students is an expert on post-traumatic growth. She lost her husband to suicide, her first husband, and she has taken that tragedy and became a suicidologist and got a Ph.D. with me and is now a professor at Eastern Kentucky University. And she runs a clinic for a PsyD program, and she's an expert in post-traumatic growth. And so that it's not for everybody, but for some people where that
Mhm.
kicks in, it's a profound thing, and their life has a new sense of direction and purpose in some ways because of
Because of the
what they
tragedy.
went through. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, in our final, just a couple of questions left. We've covered a lot, and it's been wonderful talking to you.
Lovely.
Uh, the final things that I would like to be able to shape up for parents, because again, in hearing about things in this COVID period of time, I've heard stories that I had not previously heard very much, which, a 5 or a 6-year-old kid saying, I want to kill myself, or a teenager who is, day after day in bed rather than doing her online courses. And when the parents are trying to talk to her, she's saying, I just don't want to live anymore. So there is this kind of somewhat situational, maybe, that we're in. And I wonder if you have any advice for parents who have younger children, that you wouldn't sit down with a 5-year-old, I think, really, and have a very involved, because the 5-year-old really can't tell you in words, about what this means. But I mean, do you have advice for that, how this sort of inquiry that a parent could do if a younger child says, I want to die, or I want to kill myself?
Yeah. Well, I feel like the field of suicide prevention really has missed the boat on this. We act like suicide prevention begins at puberty.
Yeah.
Cynthia Pfeffer is the only person who wrote a book in 1985 on the suicidal child.
Hmm.
It's the only book that I'm aware of.
So it's called The Suicidal Child?
Yeah, it's the name of it. And she was a psychiatrist at Cornell, I think. But that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
there are officially there are about 30 some odd completed suicides under the age of 12 in the National Death Registry. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of kids who talk about it.
Yeah.
And I would sit on the floor and talk to the child.
Hmm.
I mean, I would. I mean, we have it's on the drawing board, and it feels very high wired to me, but we have a CAMS for kids that goes down to age 4, and a
Hmm.
clinician that I've worked very closely with out in Oklahoma, who's seen 4 or 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And the first thing she does is she literally gets on the floor, she gets some Legos out, and she starts going through the suicide status form and starts asking questions in an age-appropriate way. And these kids say remarkable things.
Hmm.
And when you think what's typical for a 6-year-old, say, says, I want to kill myself, it's probably not positive.
No, no.
It's probably a slap in the face, or you don't feel that way, or a big finger point, and a big shaming and validating experience. Now, I'm not saying that they have to be therapists with their kids, but if you really kind of want to make a difference, you take what they say seriously, and then try to respond in a non activated way to understand what they actually mean. What are the needs behind what they're saying? And it's probably not to end their biological existence, but it is probably for somebody to notice that I'm really not okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So maybe using some play with your kid,
Yeah.
maybe drawing some pictures or
I would
just
go
trying
into
to
their
find out.
world. I would go into their
Yeah,
world instead of trying to pull them up to our world.
right, right,
And
right.
I would be very careful not to invalidate their experience or dismiss it as crying wolf. Uh, you know, saying these words is powerful,
Yeah,
and that it serves a function. And
yeah.
in a non-pejorative way, you can say it's instrumental because it mobilizes people's, it mobilizes adults, it mobilizes teachers, it mobilizes systems of care, or a pastor. So why wouldn't they do it if you think about it that way?
Mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm.
they feel invisible, or what they feel and think it doesn't matter, they've got to up the ante.
Yeah,
And I'm
yeah.
not trying to be provocative. I'm not trying to be insensitive to parents who are going through this. I'm just saying, if you can just for a moment, check at the door your judgment or your desire to say, don't stop being that way, and spank them, or wag your finger, and try to understand what is the need behind their words. Then
Mm-hmm.
then you're probably in a position to be more helpful. My fear is, to be candid, is that when you send them to a clinician, they're going to put them in the hospital.
Yeah,
And 8 or
yeah.
9-year-old, I mean, Cheryl came to this study at the University of Michigan showing that a second hospitalization is significantly associated with a more severe trajectory of suicidal risk and increased attempt behaviors.
Did you say second
A second
hospitalization?
hospitalization.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, yes, don't send them to a clinician to talk about it because of that issue of it sort of preempting something. But you're saying take it seriously, sit
Take it
down
serious.
with them,
And
and try
here's
to
the
have the conversation, or tell the story, or tell a story about a little kid who's like that, and
yeah,
what happens to that little kid, and why is that little kid feeling that way. So,
yeah,
I mean, there are ways you can enter in
yeah,
to that with a younger child, but mainly you're saying take it seriously.
absolutely. You'd be
And
sorry if you don't.
yeah, yeah. And then the final thing is, as I know you have said before that as people attempt, multiple attempts tend to be eventually more, how do I want to say it, that multiple attempts should be taken more and more seriously. Is that correct?
We know from the literature that people that only ideate, which is scary and worrisome, are very different
Mhm,
than people that make one attempt, or
mhm.
completely different than people that make 2 or more attempts.
Can you just summarize that quickly?
Yeah,
Just that.
it's a hurdle.
Mm,
Ideation, 12 million, 14 million people having serious suicide thoughts, that's a big population. People who actually cross over and make an attempt and survive are either scared straight or frustrated they didn't get it right.
mm,
And people are making 2 or more attempts, they're a different animal altogether for the rest of their lives,
I
according
see.
to according to the research. They've gone to that well more than once, twice. They are a much more worrisome person clinically. It doesn't mean that they can't be responsive to care. It just means that it's a different kind of level of seriousness.
Can you summarize that in any like sentence in English, like why that is the case?
I've decided that this is something I can do. that's going to end my suffering, oftentimes unburden my family as I perceive it, and it's my solution.
Mm.
The way I think about it maybe is metaphorical. I think of a train station of struggle. And there's the cutting gate, and there's the substance abusing gate, and there's the sexual acting out gate, and there's the suicide gate. The question to me is, who goes to the suicide gate, and what do they do when they get on that platform and they see the suicide train going by? Some are very frightened. They run back into the, into the main hall. Some of them go up to it and watch it. Some get on, get off, get on, get off. And the people who really think this is the thing I'm going to do, they get on and they sit down and they wait for the ride to go to this inevitable conclusion. It may seem simplistic, but that's how I think about it. That there is a relationship to suicide, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean that descriptively.
Right.
And that for people who are newer at this, it's like a hot potato. But for people for whom this becomes familiar, it becomes like a warm blanket. It's actually comforting. You can think of it as ego dystonic, ego syntonic.
Right.
And so, we know from, you mentioned hopelessness earlier, we know from studying college students, their hopelessness and teenagers, their hopelessness is really plastic.
Yes.
Really changeable. When we look at an inpatient sample at the Mayo Clinic who are like 35, 36, their hopelessness has become a way of life. Yeah. And it's a way that they know themselves. And there's a comfort in the familiarity of this. Again, I'm trying to be descriptive and not provocative.
No, it makes total sense. And I think it's also in the way you identify yourself. Like you say, you come to know yourself to be this kind of person. And there may not seem to be another option after a certain point.
Right. And so in that regard, if you do the psychological math, it really comforts somebody or helps somebody think I've got suicide and no one can stop me.
Right.
And I can end my suffering, and I can do this extraordinary thing. This is the most extraordinary thing a person can do.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
I mean, Camus said it's the only real question in philosophy.
Yeah.
Is suicide. And so if you think about it as a motivational issue, it is the ultimate motivational issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I going to continue to live today to the end of this day and go to bed and do it again tomorrow?
Right.
And for people who are really like on the fence about that, they can be saved by thoughtful, loving others, not just therapists, but by people who, take the risk to care and to reach out. And whether they reach back or not, that's the part we don't know and can't control. We wish we could, but we can't know it or control it, but we can certainly hold out our hand. And that's the way lives are saved. And that's kind of the mission that I'm on.
Well, and so that's a wonderful place to end. It's sort of a perfect place to end. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's been a lovely conversation about a terrible topic.
I agree.
But a really, really good conversation. And I'm sure many people will be helped by this. So thank you, David. And I hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I was looking forward to this very much. So thanks so much.
Such a blessing. Thank you. Bye.